Welcome to the third episode of our COVID 19 and the American Government series. Our topic for this episode is stay at home versus freedom of religion. A number of films have explored the grim reality and fear of a global outbreak of disease, which we call a pandemic. In May 2007, Hallmark Channel premiered Pandemic, a mini-series with an ensemble cast. It tells of a young American surfer who dies while on a flight back to the United States from Australia, where he contracted the virus on a beach. The entire crew and passengers were quarantined as soon as they land in Los Angeles. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention takes over the case. While processing the crew and passengers for quarantine, one of the passengers escaped and unknowingly starts spreading the virus in Los Angeles and causing chaos and death. Those of us living at present in an actual pandemic due to the coronavirus outbreak can easily relate to the events in this film. How the virus spreads quickly day to day through human contact, the chaos in the hospitals, the panic and fear in the city, the death of thousands, all remind us that we are actually experiencing this in our time. In February 2020, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC, warned that the United States braced for a domestic coronavirus outbreak. On March 11, 2020, the World Health Organization declared coronavirus disease a global pandemic. As the numbers of infected cases and deaths increased day by day, countries in Europe like Italy, Spain, France, and the United Kingdom issued lockdown orders to stop or slow down the spread of COVID-19. In March 2020, the Trump administration finally responded to the warning of the CDC by declaring a national state of emergency and banned travels from China and some parts of Europe as federal measures to stop the virus from spreading here. Americans abroad were recalled to go back home before the travel ban takes into effect. But as Americans rushed to come back home to avoid getting stranded abroad and avoid getting infected by COVID-19, the virus somehow found its way into the United States. A domestic COVID-19 outbreak, as warned by the CDC, was imminent. Today, April 7, there are more than 300,000 confirmed cases of COVID-19 in the United States and more than 12,000 deaths, with about 1,800 deaths reported in a single day. The numbers continue to rise. The absence of a national strategy on how to control the pandemic in the United States has pushed state governors to initiate their own measures to control the spread of COVID-19 in their respective states. One of these measures adopted by majority of the states is the implementation of stay-at-home orders. While some states call it shelter-in-place orders, others are calling their directives stay-at-home orders. The directives differ by location but generally require people to avoid all non-essential outings and stay inside as much as possible. On March 30, 2020, the stay-at-home order was put to test in Tampa, Florida, when the police arrested Pastor Howard Brown of the River Church. He was charged with unlawful assembly and violation of a public health emergency order when he held two Sunday services packed with hundreds of people. His lawyers, however, argued 6-foot distancing was observed during the Sunday services and the church was sanitized. They also charged that the arrest was discriminatory to religion and church gatherings. Pastor Howard Brown isn't alone in refusing to refrain from conducting physically attended public worship services despite public health orders designed to stop the virus from spreading. Churches in Ohio, Kentucky, and Louisiana have continued to invite worshipers in recent days on the basis of the First Amendment right to freedom of religion. What is freedom of religion? Again, the First Amendment of the United States Constitution states that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. There are two clauses or main points on freedom of religion in the Constitution. The first one is known as the Establishment Clause. This means that the government cannot make laws that establishes a state or national religion or favors a particular religion or religions. This gave birth to the principle of the separation of state and church. The second one is known as the Free Exercise Clause. This means that the government cannot make laws that will prohibit anyone from freely exercising his or her religion, like going to church on Sundays, for example. The 14th Amendment also ensures that freedom of religion, as stated in the First Amendment, should also be observed by all the states and territories of the United States. With regards to the issue on religious freedom in relation to stay-at-home orders, we therefore ask these essential questions. First, is our amendment right of freedom of religion violated when state governments implement stay-at-home orders where in-person public worship and other religious gatherings are not allowed? Second, can we classify going to church or attending religious gatherings as essential services and therefore exempted from stay-at-home orders? Americans are entitled to religious freedom, but just as there are limitations to freedom of speech, freedom of press, and freedom of assembly, so there are limitations to freedom of religion. In the landmark Supreme Court case of Reynolds versus United States 1979, George Reynolds, a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, was charged with bigamy under the Federal Morrill Anti-Bigamy Act after marrying a woman while still married to his previous wife. Reynolds argued that the law was unconstitutional He reasoned that his religion required him to marry multiple women, and the law therefore violated his First Amendment right to free exercise of religion. When the case was elevated to the Supreme Court, Reynolds' conviction for the crime of bigamy was upheld. The court reasoned that one cannot use religious duty or belief as an excuse to commit a crime. This then is one of the limitations on freedom of religion. We are free to believe anything we want to believe in, but we are not free to practice a belief that violates any general law relating to public order, public health, public safety, or morality. Another Supreme Court landmark case of Sherbert versus Verner, 1963. Mrs. Adele Sherbert sued her employer when she was fired for refusing to work on Saturdays. Mrs. Sherbert was a member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which religiously obliged its members not to work on Saturday, their day of worship. She was also denied unemployment benefits by the South Carolina Employment Security Commission because she did not have a good reason to refuse to work on Saturdays. When the case was elevated to the Supreme Court, it ruled in the favor of Mrs. Adele Sherbert. In a majority opinion written by Justice Brennan, the court held that the state's eligibility restrictions for employment compensation imposed a significant burden on Mrs. Sherbert's ability to freely exercise her faith. Furthermore, there was no compelling state interest which justified such substantial burden on this basic First Amendment right. The Supreme Court ruling on Sherbert versus Verner created what is known as the Sherbert test. This test became the basis by which the court analyzes issues on our First Amendment rights, particularly freedom of religion. The court asks the following questions. First, does the state policy impose a substantial burden on one's right to free exercise of religion? Substantial burden means that the pressure is strong and affects a really important or vital part of one's religious beliefs. In the case of Sherbert versus Verner, was there a substantial burden on Mrs. Sherbert? In other words, did the state government's action infringe Mrs. Sherbert's constitutional right of freedom of religion? Yes, there was a substantial burden because she was pressured to give up her religious obligation in order to work on Saturday to retain her job. She was even fired for her refusal to give up her religious obligation to worship on Saturdays as an Adventist. Second, if there is a substantial burden, is there a compelling state interest to justify it? Compelling state interest is a strong matter of public concern that is addressed by a government through a law or policy. Again, in the case of Sherbert versus Verner, was there a compelling state interest to deny Mrs. Sherbert her unemployment benefits because of her religious beliefs? Will the public be in danger if Mrs. Sherbert chooses to worship instead of working on Saturdays? Of course not. Thus, the Supreme Court did not find a compelling state interest to deprive Mrs. Sherbert of her unemployment benefits because of her religious obligation to worship on Saturdays? Third, if there is a compelling state interest, is this narrowly tailored, or is it the least restrictive means to achieve this interest? Narrowly tailored means that state law or policy is designed to serve legitimate concerns like safety, with as few restrictions as possible on constitutional rights. In other words, is there any other way for the government to implement such law without restricting fundamental freedoms? In the case of Mrs. Sherbert, yes. There were other ways to implement the law where Mrs. Sherbert's rights to free exercise of religion as protected by the First Amendment would not be affected. The state could have just simply given her unemployment benefits until she finds a job, which does not require her to work on Saturdays. If we subject the stay-at-home order to Sherbert test, the same scrutiny will be followed. First, does the stay-at-home order place a substantial burden on our right to free exercise of religion? Second, is the stay-at-home order justified by a compelling state interest? And third, is the compelling state interest narrowly tailored? Let us look into these questions one by one. First, does the stay-at-home order place a substantial burden on our right to free exercise of religion? This depends on the extent of the stay-at-home order in each state with regards to religious practice. Some states exempt religious services for the stay-at-home restrictions as essential services, while other states do not. New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio, for example, does not consider religious services as essential services. He directed the police and fire department to stop and disperse religious gatherings or public worship amidst COVID-19 pandemic. Violators will be fined and even have their churches closed permanently. Can leaders of churches or synagogues claim that a substantial burden has been placed on their right of free exercise of religion? Remember that in the case of Sherbert versus Verner, she was torn between her livelihood and religious duty, which became a substantial burden on her. To claim substantial burden, therefore, these religious leaders must prove that there is a strong pressure on them to abandon their freedom to practice their religion. On March 30, 2020, Mayor de Blasio explains his hardline policy on considering religious gatherings as non-essential services. He said, "I understand how important people's faith are to them, and we need our faith in this time of crisis, but we do not need gatherings that will endanger people." Based on his reason, he made it clear that he is not placing a substantial burden to prevent people from having faith. What he is preventing is endangering people from contacting or spreading COVID-19 when they go out of their homes to attend in-person religious gatherings. Next, is the stay-at-home order justified by a compelling state interest? Let me reiterate that compelling state interest is a strong matter of public concern that is addressed by a government through a law or policy. So what is the strong matter of public concern that is being addressed by the state's stay-at-home orders at this time? The answer is the COVID-19 pandemic that has claimed thousands of lives. This compelling state interest to protect the public from the coronavirus outbreak can therefore override the substantial burden claims of religious leaders and their followers that there is a strong pressure against their freedom to exercise their religion. Religion is not banned. It is religious gatherings where social distancing is impossible to control that are being restricted. However, if Mayor de Blasio will permanently close the churches or synagogues in his city without a compelling state interest, he is clearly violating freedom of religion under the First Amendment, particularly under the principle of the separation of church and the state. And third, is the compelling state interest narrowly tailored? Yes, there is no other way to prevent the spread of coronavirus or COVID-19 other than social distancing through stay-at-home orders. There is not yet a vaccine nor a treatment for COVID-19. Very little is still known about this virus. Strict implementation of stay-at-home orders have slowed down the spread of the virus. Stay-at-home is a temporary measure to safeguard public health and safety. This pandemic will come to an end at one point, which means that stay-at-home orders will be lifted. Most churches have been creative in providing religious services to their members. Majority have resorted to online worship that can be accessed without government censorship. Personal religious devotion is encouraged. Membership in religious establishments is not banned. Production and distribution of religious items is not prohibited. There is still freedom of religion. There are two religious virtues that are relevant to our study on religious freedom. The first one is piety. Piety is defined as devotion and reverence to religious practices and God. An example of piety is going to church. The second one is prudence. Prudence is defined as the ability to govern and discipline oneself by the use of reason. An example of prudence is staying at home because of illness instead of going to church. Piety is an expression of one's devotion to one's faith or religious beliefs. Prudence cautions us to use our reason to express our faith wisely without unnecessarily exposing ourselves to danger. In this time of COVID-19 pandemic, it is admirable that one practice piety, that is to be religious, but it is also important to be prudent, that is to be cautious and reasonable. Be pious, yes, but be prudent at the same time in practicing our First Amendment right to religious freedom. Be safe, God bless, stay at home. I miss you all till we meet again.